The Knight Errant by DearAgonist and Ostheim89. Narrated by Captain Kate. Chapter 3. The Left Wing. Private First Class Milo Christ of Unit 9 was bleeding out into Lilith's hands. He was young and had been harassed or startled or something while taking his little stint of leave in Pohang. And, in the infinite stupidity of young soldiers, had fired back into the crowd at his pursuers. Someone had pulled a zip gun then, and through some alignment of misfortune and timing, took him deep in the pocket of his shoulder. He was now gasping under her, like a fish out of water, yawning in pain, gushing arterial blood up between her fingers. Someone had already wrestled the shooter to the ground, and who knew where the fucking firearm was? The ring of soldiers around her were too busy holding back the flocking, panicked, fascinated crowd to help her. And despite her cries of "medic" until her throat was hoarse, no one came running. So, she told Milo he was going to die. That's not what you ever saw anyone doing in the films or stories. They always held fast and told them that they'll make it. To stay with me. Stay awake. But Lilith found that she was something of an ethical realist all of a sudden. Reasonably, morally, it was the right thing to do. She had to be honest. And at least some of the panic left his eyes as he laid there, slipping into shock. The body does not have enough blood to circulate, and so it starts to numb itself, constrict the vessels in the extremities, keep it all pumping in the vital organs. But then, it gets cold anyways, and the heart stops pumping. Then death. The night was very cold. Lilith's hands were very hot. Someone was knocking on the door. Elster's eyes fluttered open, still briefly trapped in that nebulous space between dreaming and waking, before she realized the noise was quite real, though not quite insistent. Hypnagogia. That's what Ariane called it. Her vocabulary was always bigger than Elster's. She'd just compare it to atmospheric pressures or something. Another rap at the door. Polite, almost, as though the caller were reluctant to actually disturb anyone. Somewhere along the way, she'd fallen asleep again, curled up on the narrow spot on the couch between the edge and Ariane's comatose body. Elster's idea, of course. Her nerves had gotten the better of her, and she'd decided to spurn the cold metal of the gurney in favor of a warmer place to rest. Better for Ariane's comfort, she told herself. Superstitious, more like, as if the cold was influencing Ariane's fitful dreams. At the same time, it was some old habit she didn't really know she had. One of those flashes of recognition she detected in her own behavior. The logic was simple. If she put herself between Ariane and the outside world, her most vulnerable moments included, Elster would take the brunt of all damage. Some fucking good that was. Wrong place. Wrong time. It was that easy for everything to fall apart. Sometimes her ears start ringing when she thinks like this. Pings of violet noise, peeking LiDAR charts seen behind drowsy eyes. Maybe she'd been onto something. The cold had stopped after all. Progress. She forced her eyes open, watched Ariane's placid, sleeping expression for a moment longer, pressed a kiss to her forehead, and then rolled off the couch, quietly onto the floor. Conspicuously silent, Ariane had described her once. A joyful little memory. Elster had abused that quality, more times than she could remember. She got up and went to the door, pulling it open just a crack to see an oiler unit's tiny, owlish face, prompting Elster, "Hello," with a nervous smile. Mouse, she was fairly certain. The other one preferred to smirk. It helped that they'd just talked not long ago, but she was still having trouble telling them apart. What? Mouse's lips flattened for the briefest of seconds, only to then redouble in stubborn intensity. Elster instantly found it obnoxious. The last time she'd properly dealt with oilers was before she shipped out. That flock of school teachers that saw her as an anomaly. Two things, if that's all right. Are you, Elster glanced back at the room's other, silent occupant, then shrugged impassively. Not busy. Great. Should I come in? Or... She tilted her head to the right, as though to look past Elster, who was reasonably certain she was occupying the entire door crack. By way of answer, Elster swung the door open, just enough to slip out into the hall, before carefully shutting the door behind her. Old habits. But Elster couldn't help but squirm in discomfort. A sting of foolishness tugging on her biomechanical heart. She was trying to be quiet when all she wanted was to wake Ariane up. She should have been slamming doors and screaming her conversation with Mouse. But it wouldn't work. Nothing so mundane. She pressed the emotion away, somehow, and stared at Mouse expectantly, painfully aware of how tired she must have looked. None of it had anything to do with restfulness. First off, Mouse began, clearing her throat. How is she? The same. And the cold? Elster grunted softly, folding her mismatched arms. The replacement was sleeker, obviously newer than the rest of her weathered frame, and she knew it was noticeable. It was probably the only way the others told her and Paul apart. She didn't feel terribly out of place in that regard, though. Practically all of the mine replicas looked battered by the elements, having lived inside a dark tunnel for months, having worked in it for even longer. Mouse herself was certainly not the picture of a prim and proper oiler unit, with faded dirt smears and scratches scattered across her arms, legs, and chest. Any other oiler would have been beside themselves with dismay, but Mouse looked as though she barely paid her blemishes any mind. At least, as far as Elster could tell. She was never very good with people. "It went away," she belatedly answered. To Mouse's credit, she was taking Ariane's quirks in stride. Bioresonance wasn't exactly new for any of them, but changes in the weather, mystery whispers filling the night, and random geoformations appearing out of nowhere in the ground were certainly far outside a Calibri's capabilities. She was keeping it together, though, and she only nodded once at Elster's reply. "Good." She swallowed, as though preparing to say something unpleasant. Elster tensed up on reflex. No, she wasn't good at reading faces, but she could at least see problems coming. "Sanität private, C. Mock," wrung her cap in her hands, dismayed. She had failed the amputation of an ensign's leg, and must now deliver a cool and calculated report, as if she was not soaked to her elbows in blood. Fortunately, it was only a problem for her, or at least that's what Elster assumed by the begrudging tone her voice took. "Jans talked to Fireher, so she'll be keeping a regular watch on Ariane while we're gone." Elster's eyebrow rose. "We?" "I'm coming to the city, with you and Paul." "Out of the question." Mouse was instantly stunned, wide eyes watching Elster as if to wait for a confession that she'd misspoken. Paul had mentioned that they'd need a medic, hadn't she? Still, Elster considered. Sour taste in her mouth. Oiler units weren't exactly battlefield medics, but Mouse had performed well enough at Velesh. Svetloya was an entire city, however, filled with who knew how many corrupted. And who knew whom else? Elster sincerely doubted, at this juncture, that the Hausdorff survivors were the only ones. It'd make Velesh look like a joke, and Elster wanted to get through it as simply as possible. Maybe Paul was right. Maybe she would need help. But the smaller an infiltration team was, the easier they'd manage. Assuming said team had actual intel and support, of course. A brief flash of frustration there, mixed with begrudging respect. Paul was right, in the end, and she didn't like it. Mouse would be useful, probably, if she shot straight and didn't fuck up. In their dugout, Elise and Yosefka worked over their radios. Urgent. Efficient. Elise flashed a thumbs up, grinning. Yosefka was too busy. She waved back. Oilers. But comrades. That only left one niggling concern. "Why?" she blurted out, just as Mouse was opening her mouth to, no doubt, protest. It was Mouse's turn to look bemused. She glanced past Elster's arm towards the door and shrugged. "She helped me. I help her. Simple." Just like that. Mouse's expression hardened just a little. Unmistakable. "Look, I'd be dead right now if you hadn't come here. I'd be dead. So I'm coming, and that's that." A black thought couldn't quite help but bubble forth through Elster's lips before she had the chance to stop herself. "That could still happen. If you come." "I know. Mouse's smile was devoid of humor. But I'm still coming. What would she resort to next? Screaming at her? Telling her she absolutely could not come along? No point in it. And what did it matter anyway? Maybe it would matter to Ariane's eternally guilty conscience, always remiss to implicate others. Maybe Elster was starting to inherit those concerns as her own. There was comfort in always being the voice of doubt, uncertainty, incredulous in the face of Ariane's seemingly bottomless and decidedly foolish empathy. She would be flattered or terrified, and Elster would calmly inform her that they could do this all by themselves, without risking anyone else's lives, or, more chiefly, their own. Deep in the back of her mind, though, she knew the truth of that was all too obvious. Ariane would be torn up. She would hate herself, obsessing over the fact that there was a problem and that she had caused it. How many times had Elster heard her say, "It's my fault"? She would cover her face in her hands and squirm and curl into a ball and cry when she thought no one was looking. And Elster would stand there and wring her hands and agonize over how best to protect her love from the world itself. Or, worse yet, herself. It could have all been avoided if they'd just kept flying. Fine, she muttered. Who else? Zwei, Paul and Jens. Elster, who had been staring past Mouse's shoulder, blinked down at her, silently flummoxed at that final name. Mouse was not stupid by any stretch, and proceeded to shrug apologetically. She insisted. Why? Elster repeated, a sharp pain in the left of her skull. Replicas weren't supposed to get headaches. She'd never gotten any at all until 1,000 or so cycles in. You'd have to ask her, Mouse said, humming under her breath as she idly stared at Ariane's door. If I had to guess, though, she thinks this is important enough to want to come herself. And it takes a lot to convince Jens that something is important. She just wants to fucking micromanage this, Elster snarled, purely irritated. She would, too. It was so like a star to do that. Think that they knew better than anyone else. Discipline, hierarchy, all of that bullshit the nation had drilled into them. Tedious. Then, without realizing what she was really talking about, she said, I've dealt with it before. Well, she was going to send Luca, but honestly, if you want my opinion. She glanced up at Elster as though for permission, who simply nodded down at her, still lost in her own swirling, red thoughts. I think she's, got a thing for Ariel. Definitely a headache. No mistaking it. Elster wanted to sit. Wanted something to repair. Wanted desperately to screw her girlfriend and hold her hand afterwards. She sighed deeply instead, and pinched the bridge of her nose, just beneath the faceplate seam. I don't care about that. Okay. Mouse folded her hands behind her back, staring off into space. She's going to... Try to be the boss, Mouse asked, tilting her head and nodding. Yes. But she's a military woman. You'll be fine. Elster units are supposed to be scouts anyways, right? Right, Elster muttered, a sinking sensation of misery crawling across her stomach. She was supposed to be a pioneer on some distant fucking planet, trying to triangulate appropriate spots for future colonies. She was supposed to fix her ship and read her instruments and set up secure camping spots under an alien sky. That was what she was trained for. That was the part of her they'd emphasized. Always. She was never supposed to be a killer. She was never supposed to be that sort of Elster unit. The ones who stalked through lonely battlefields and had an uncanny eye for targets of opportunity. And yet, she'd never gotten the chance to be anything but. Mouse stared at her for a second or two longer than she was comfortable with, and Elster very much wanted to turn her gaze away before she murmured, "Are you all right?" "Fine," Elster lied. I'm frustrated." Mouse took a second to click her tongue, thoughtful. If she detected the lie, she did not show it. Or maybe they were all just used to Elster obfuscating her intent. Yes, I get it. But I think we'll be okay." Her smile returned abruptly, however subdued. "Besides, if my hunch is right, she'll be busy protecting the ship anyway." Elster still, in fact, did not care about that, or want to think about it. She was abruptly seized with the powerful compulsion to simply leave during the night and take the ship without anyone seeing her. They wouldn't be able to stop her that way, and then she could just do this the way she wanted to. Quick, decisive, efficient, the way it had to be done. Now she had to deal with some fucking military, bureaucratic shit, and it was making her fiercely upset. Paul's words echoed in her ears, though, unbidden. She couldn't afford to fail, not with Ariane on the line. Things were different now, and there'd be no do-overs. She could not get back up. She could not keep getting back up. The thought alone made the oxidant in her veins run cold, and she quickly shook her head. "Right. Is that it? You vouch for Svi?" Mouse brightened. "I do. She's a bit more cheerful and animated than a lot of Aris. If anything happens to the ship, you'll be glad she's there." "Fine. So me, you, Paul, Jans, Ariel, and her." "Right. Is that good, you think?" Good was lying on a couch in the room behind her. Everything else was merely some varying degree of tolerable or intolerable. "You will not have to worry about team cohesion. Elster units are designed to awaken and conduct their duties in staggered cycles, away from the Gestalt scout officer aboard. Do not attempt to socialize with the Gestalt scout officer aboard. Only contact your superior for relevant alerts on ship and sensor integrity." She shrugged and shook her head, despite muttering, "Sure." That headache was like a hot nail poised against her temple. Mouse reached out and put a hand delicately on her shoulder. which seemed to crawl instantly underneath Elster's shell, who glared at her with emphatic discomfort. To her credit, at least, she quickly withdrew her hand. Sorry. Works with the errors. I think it'll be good if you have people helping you. I know you're close to her. I know. Elster silently took a step back, Mouse's words dying abruptly on her lips. They stared at one another for a second too long, before Elster turned back to the door and grabbed the handle. Just be ready to leave by tonight. Yeah, of course. She was already slouching, already frowning and turning away. Please let me know if anything happens with her. Fiha will be here soon to check in. Elster did not reply, and was not at all sure that she felt all that much better as soon as the door had shut behind her and left her alone with a silent, unmoving Ariane. But that was hardly the worst part of it. Worst was soon. Soon, it'd be time to leave her. Again. Can you hear me? You can. I know you can hear me. That's how it works with you. Stronger than you ever give yourself credit for. You know that? I guess the world knew that already. Like it always has. It makes me wonder about us, sometimes. Nothing like what Paul said that one time. I don't think you charmed me, or... how would you describe it? Ensorcelled. That's the word. Nothing like that. More just... It just makes even less sense now. Maybe you really didn't know back then. I don't know what brought it out. Desperation? Misery? Didn't we have enough of that? Was it death? I just get to wondering about if we'd known. If this was always inside of you, then... I don't know. Maybe we could have just kept going. Just like we always wanted. Forever. We'd find new planets. Catalog them. Keep them for ourselves. They could be our planets. And we could name them after the ones you lost. Or the people in your books and movies. Or each other. The terrestrial planet Ariane 1. And its moon. Elster. No, Ellie. You're right. Sorry, just I know you'd be arguing with me if you were awake. Can't do that now. I get the final say. Ha. I know you'd be saying something like, no, this is for the best. We have to help people. We have to meet people. I miss people, Ellie. I miss all those horrible, fucking miserable people who hurt me, abused me, and would have never let me be who I am. Didn't I let you? Sorry, I'm still trying to argue and you're not even awake. I'm sorry, Ari. I shouldn't. You're probably up there somewhere, just yelling at me, annoyed at me, and I wouldn't even know. I don't know what I'm even saying. I'm leaving you again. It feels like again. I don't know. Did death count? You never told me how long you were alone. I don't know. It feels different, but the same. Like I've done this before. Been separated from you before. I wish I could remember. I really wish I could remember. It's right there. I can see it sometimes when I shut my eyes. Looking for you. Always looking for you. But it doesn't stick. It's slippery. Like your paint, Ari. I know I'm probably not making any sense. I miss you. I will continue to miss you. But I'll come back. And you'll wake up. And I'm gonna be the first thing you see. I will. Just be good. Be good for everyone else. I don't want them to hurt you, okay? Because I wouldn't forgive them if they did. I'd never forgive them, ever. Someone was knocking. Hold on. I love you. I'll come back. I promise. I'll come back for you. Well, would you look at that? Ariel said. It seems we've incidentally fulfilled the parameters they intended for ships like this. Gestalt and replica working together, achieving a singular purpose. Elster did not like this whatsoever. She watched him with a certain detached apathy, but he knew how to see between the cracks, how to read between the lines. There was the occasional flicker of anger in her typically steely expression, when it was not strained with the naked frustration of their disparate circumstances. And they were disparate indeed. A ragtag little gang out to save the day, even if that primarily concerned Elster's selfish, personal interests. Ariel had briefly entertained the idea that, eventually, someone might just go execute Ariane wholesale. In his mind's eye, however, he saw the bullet flattening on itself mid-air and promptly rebounding back through the attacker's skull or throat, intent appropriately nullified. Perhaps intent was part of all this. later philosophizing on bioresonance to be had. Elster's cold regard finally gave, if only by an inch, and she said, "I don't think that's how it works." "No, but I was trying to make light, I suppose." "Not with me." "I imagine not." Ariel turned back to his devices, familiarizing himself with the cockpit. Pilot's manual unfolded over his lap. "Was it nice out there? Whatever compelled you to return to this wretched place?" Silence. He heard the parting of lips, and nothing more. The soft click of tongue as Elster resolved her answer. "We never left the docks at Veneta." This instantly did not line up in Ariel's head, considering he had followed them from the outer system inward. He had started on Lang, went to Heimat, then to Kitesh. The series of events was wrong, but that was fine. It wasn't as if he had been the most truthful man since the very moment they met. I imagined that the apocalypse would halt some exit flights, yes. The majesty of the stars will have to wait, while we all get our collective shit together. If only. He missed the order of things, the structures to lean on. This was all very tiresome, and the effort invested was tenfold what he was used to. He missed, especially, imperial hotels. They always had nice suites. "Was it nice? Traveling in your Penrose, I mean. The two of you seemed especially equipped. Comfortable." Elster answered him with an emphatic shrug. "We were lucky to find more supplies than we knew what to do with. That's all." He almost followed up with, "On Heimat?" But that would have blown any semblance of cover he had. Remember intent, Ariel. Intent mattered here. "What about Scout Officer Young's resonance? You weren't afraid of it? Didn't it ever manifest itself? Would you even have to worry about supplies? Or would she just know where to go?" "Never," Elster said. "I didn't know." She would have been an absolutely fantastic liar if Ariel did not already have quite a bit of what she was pinned down by now. "So I imagine you're just as startled as the rest of us." She squinted at him. "You mean scared?" He shrugged, conceding. And she said, "I'm not scared of Ariane." "Yes, you seem fond of her. Fond of her and the potential for adventure, I suppose? You must be. Perhaps the Penrose program knew when they made her a pilot. All by design." "Like I said, we never got to find out. There was no expedition. No flight. Everything fell apart before we were able to leave. And so we took the ship, cut the radios, left." She shook her head. "Where are you getting at with this?" "I guess I'm wondering about you too," Ariel said, hardly gleaming much from his materials now. "What kind of person you are. If you looked forward to the program, maybe." "It doesn't matter," she answered. "I was made with a purpose, wasn't I?" "But didn't you hope? Hope to find something? Some unknown world out... Where was it they were sending you?" "The Oort Cloud." "The Oort Cloud. You had to hope there was more than ice out there, didn't you?" "I never hoped for much," Elster said, hovering now near the co-pilot's seat, looking down at Ariel. "I was meant to keep it in shape." Run the appropriate protocols if we ever did encounter a discovery scenario. Anticipation was never part of it. Ambition, you mean? Ariel corrected. Elster squinted at him. Whatever. Right then. Manual abandoned. He was feeling chatty, much to her evident chagrin, but he couldn't help himself. He had always been something of a social person. It helped with his work, after all. Intelligence agents, not spies, which was such a nasty word, weren't the kind of people who got a little antsy when making a cafe order. But you, Elster. Ellie, absolutely not. Elster, he acquiesced, are clearly a person, substantially realized. Agent, no matter if there's hundreds of you made, right? Each one branches off on some unique path of thought. Surely you thought to yourself, somewhere along the way, oh, I'd love to fulfill this particular niche of exogeology. No? And she just slowly shook her head at him. Frustrating. At least, I would hope so. That something might differentiate you between the machines of the Empire. A flicker across her brow. Anger. Insult stirred her out of her stoicism, it seemed. Good. What is that meant to mean? He flicked a wrist idly. Capricious. This degradation we might accuse you or any of the other replica of? Rubbish. You're simply following human nature. To change. To grow. To hope. You would not be doing this if you were not hopeful. Why are you talking about this? She balled up a fist. He smiled. I enjoy a challenging conversation. And it was true. Partially, he was just entertaining himself, as curious as he really was. Always felt nice to feel like an academic about something. Funny how he shared that in common with someone without even knowing it. It seemed the philosophizing was happening here and now. And I would like to try and know my comrades better, even if they are temporary. She scoffed, a rueful half-smile on her face. What does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. There's nothing to be gained from it. There is. We're all linked together. We may as well strengthen those chains. Ah, wrong choice of word. Threads. For example, yourself and Scout Officer Young. What about us? Closed off again. Cautious. Interesting how she moved. Her hands were much tighter. For all the differences in the world, all that Ariel could see that set them apart in that moment was that seam of resin across her nose and cheekbones. Replicas were so much more interesting than their confines allowed them to be. Perfectly and exactly Gestalt, really. Just with a bit of pre-coding, perhaps. Ariel simpered lightly up at her. Innocent. You two were each other's most important halves. Totally and utterly reliant upon one another. What did that do to you? The knife was dug in now. The seat creaked lightly underneath Elster's fist. What do you mean? What did that do to me? So much time spent together. We never left Veneta Orbital. Alone. Stuck in this little shell. Are you listening to me? Twisted. I just wonder how it came to be. It has to be the most beautiful story. Surviving together. Not so frowned upon in the Empire, but there's a different nuance there. How was it that Elster lurched very abruptly in his face, and he was surprised she did not grab or strike at him? Instead, coolly and perfectly level, she asked, "Why did Jans join us?" A cold slither swept its way down Ariel's throat as he exhaled, settling neatly in his chest. He had not thought about that. He did not want to think about it. And he very sorely wanted to call Elster out on her game, but that would be terribly hypocritical. A betrayal of his own methods. He had pushed her, and like an animal backed into a corner, she'd lashed out and returned the favor. It only made sense, and it was only fair, as much as he wanted to be bitter about it. With a serene smile, Ariel Shaw said, "I'm going to continue familiarizing myself with the controls." He was thoroughly surprised she had talked with him as much as she did to begin with. And Elster, to the credit of her confidence, said, "I'll be right here if you want to talk," and sat down, incandescent, in the co-pilot's seat, beginning her own pre-flight checks with a certain violent undercurrent to every flick of a switch and push of a button. They'd have a printout of Svetloya not long before they got close to it. It was still just a distant dot on Kitesh's curved horizon, but that was enough. The scout ship LiDAR scanners hadn't become any less potent in the years they were gone. Quite the contrary. The suite was only marginally more impressive, and therefore imminently easy for Elster to understand. A thermographic short-range scanner was the foremost feature that 512 had lacked. A serious deficiency that had inspired a short-lived bout of anxiety early into the trip, when they still believed they might find an alien world. Elster had, of course, been worried about them missing any hostile life, or any life at all, slim as the chance was. Of course, the chances ended up being 0 in the end, so it never mattered. They never encountered anything the tech would have been worthy of, and Elster had been surprised to discover it on the new ship. Why bother? If she took a moment to think like one of the nation's cruel engineers, it was simply a waste of money and effort. But maybe they'd resolved to try harder with the program in recent years. Yet still, that doubt. Did they even believe in what they were trying to achieve? Or was it just a convenient way of population culling? Somehow cheaper than residential blocks? That was Ariane speaking in her head, probably. Always very political. Or maybe, more likely, it had become cheaper to manufacture such tech, thanks to the Empire's ailing fortunes. There was no one around left to ask, not that they'd ever be truthful, and Elster would have sooner shoved the barrel of her revolver into their mouth and pulled the trigger first. Ariel had vacated the flight deck, duly replaced by Paul. The others, she was fairly sure, were crowding the mess hall, and either making plans or engaging in what little small talk they might muster up. Elster watched the built-in console printer whir and buzz with activity as it slowly deposited sheet after sheet of cartographic information into neat little piles. helpfully numbered so operators could assemble a complete picture once the tedious task was done. All they'd needed were a set of coordinates to input, northwest to southeast in a grid. As simplistic as it would have been mildly headache-inducing to actually use on an alien planet. Ariane, naturally, had used the ink for painting and writing things down. Elster had learned how to crack the cartridge seals open and extract it all without making an apocalyptic mess. Thermographic data would come next, then topographic minus all the buildings and city streets, and so on and so forth. And Elster was mostly just staring off into space and dwelling on how bizarre it was to have a bunch of voices coming out of the depths of her ship. They were muffled and unintelligible and reminded her vaguely of ghosts, for some reason. Ghosts thumping against the vents. Just having Paul around had been strange enough previously. She'd felt the same way on the journey over to Velesh, but Svetloya was further away still. And Ariane had been there to keep her grounded, despite the awkwardness permeating the air between them in the wake of their argument. Now, there was no one to really distract her. Just an odd chorus of unfamiliar voices, echoing off of familiar walls. To make matters worse, one of those voices was sometimes a copy of her own. It felt like an intrusion, home invasion. Much as she tried to put the notion out of mind, Elster had found it was all she could think about once the novelty of actually printing out data wore off. Very quickly. Paul was flying the ship for the time being, content to allow Elster to pore over the information. But so far, all she'd accomplished was staring at the pages dumbly. Fuck, it wasn't even 512 anymore. What did she care? Why did she care so much? There was no good answer to that. Nothing logical, it was just wrong. Maybe Ariel's prodding had gotten under her skin too much, shone too much of a bright light on the way things used to be. The way things, in her mind, were supposed to be. Had he done that on purpose? 250 kilometers out, Paul murmured, glancing up from the flight instruments. Elster didn't blink. She'd been reading off distances since they'd gotten within 500 kilometers out. They weren't gunning the Penrose as fast as it could have traveled within a vacuum, else it would have been a vanishingly short trip. Right, Elster grunted, prompting a glance from her counterpart. No mystery there. Elster hadn't acknowledged the other few times. Magpies were good at noticing small changes. Have we got a map yet? Elster checked the page count and sighed. Just about. We'll need to make a more compact version, Paul mused, glancing aside briefly at the stack of papers. Agreed. Something to work on once we're locked into a holding pattern over the city. Someone laughed behind them, Ariel by the sound of it. A short and concise chuckle, followed by Mouse's fluttery giggling. Elster leaned into the back of her seat and shut her eyes, a whimper crawling doggedly up her throat, only to be strangled there. Paul did not seem to notice. Right, she repeated, quietly. Paul was silent still for another minute or so, until she turned her head, almost imperceptibly to the side. This is all pretty strange, isn't it? Elster, who had been content to suffer in perfect, yearning silence, creaked one eye open by way of answer. Using all our training for this, Paul explained, content to keep going. Not some new world, just Kitesh. She'd been about to shut the conversation down as quaint and irrelevant, but it occurred to Elster that it was, in fact, quite strange indeed. And almost precisely what she'd been worrying about to begin with. Were they the very first Elster units attached to the Penrose program to use their instruments for their intended purpose? No way of ever knowing, she supposed. The thought experiment straddled that strange liminal ground between morbidly comforting and horrifying. That the suffering she and Ariane had endured had not been all that unique in the end. That failure was uniform and expected of them. That, in fact, others before and after them had gone through a similar shared misery. Was there not a certain comfort in that? In being typical? That was also, of course, the awful part. She knew that, but an even bleaker notion had suddenly sprouted up in her mind's eye. The idea that someone hadn't failed. That one of those crews had found a world worth disappearing on. A perfect refuge that only they would know about. Free to live however they chose to live. The lucky ones that she and Ariane had always dreamed of being. Elster knew the possibility was vanishingly small, and that, in all likelihood, the same fate the two of them had met would have been the same across all missions. But just that slim chance, that decimal point, inside a decimal point, inside a decimal point. Somehow, it made her quietly, pointlessly furious. There was no way of proving it had happened. No way to disprove it either. An awful paradox, which, with the forces at play around Ariane, only served to summon up some secondary, underlying fear she hadn't realized before. Her shoulders slackened, and she found herself staring hard at the viewport and the hazy blue-black sky beyond, up towards the cosmos. Little pinpricks of light, barely visible. Hall had pitched them up just a little, readying for their final descent inward. She would have liked some distant vista to focus on right then, to spirit her away from the useless sting of bitterness infesting her heart. It should not have mattered anymore. They were alive. They might, in fact, have been the only mission's crew to ever return. Try as she might to let that truth settle her frustration, all she could see when she shut her eyes was that glorious, bizarre alien world, and Ariane laughing, pointing at distant mountains and sprinting through strangely colored reeds. Just the two of them. I guess, she eventually replied, monotone. On cue, the printer made a loud, affirming buzz as the final map page politely joined the rest of its brethren at the top of the pile. Elster mechanically grabbed the stack and got up, adjusting the mechanisms for the line of thermal printouts. They'd need to be overhead for those. Then silently moved towards the mess hall. Only a few steps, not even 10 seconds to herself. But she relished in the temporary solitude all the same. The din of conversation died away even before the mess hall door slid open, revealing the rest of her impromptu expedition party, who were all staring at her as she entered. Jans, somehow the most baffling of the volunteers, was standing by the entrance mid-pace, arms folded. Her attention was more on the trove of information in her hands rather than Elster herself. About time, she grunted, reaching over to take the stack, which Elster was all too glad to surrender. Absently, she thought back to what Mouse had said, but found herself oddly repelled by the notion that disciplined, rugged Jans had joined them out of a peculiar fixation with Ariel's show. It had to be enough, she figured, that Ariane's continued coma represented too grave a threat to entrust to any of her underlings. Surely it was that. There goes our table room, Zwei sighed, even as she began to clear off space, lounging on one of the table seats opposite from Mouse, who was doing much the same. Elster didn't know much about her. The Aras were the most common unit, numbering at 5, but they mostly kept to themselves, besides this one, evidently a closer friend of Mouse. It was likely why she'd come along at all. She certainly didn't seem to hold Ariane in any higher regard than anyone else. Aras had ever been an enigma to Elster, only spotted in passing on Veneta Orbital while she was in training, always on their way to some maintenance task or another. Zwei at least seemed somewhat more personable than the others, offering a lazy wave. Elster immediately decided that she liked her, if only for her laconic aura. Someone who sat back and didn't make much trouble, listened to what they were told. Her preferred kind of person. Esther, Mouse chirped, standing right up alongside Zwei and stepping over to join her friend. Are we close? Before answering, she gave Ariel, who had turned away again, the briefest of glances. He was sat in the middle table seat, where Ariane had almost always parked herself while the two of them ate. From behind, the two might as well have been identical in profile, assuming Ariane had bothered cutting her hair in a few months. He was, quite peculiarly, being very quiet, rubbing thoughtfully at a bit of stubble that had finally sprouted on his chin, staring with some far-off gaze which surely meant he was plotting. Elster did not like the idea of Ariel's show plotting. She looked away again as Jan stepped into view, already beginning to lay out sheet after sheet of paper on the limited table space. We're close, she confirmed, droll as any radio operator after too many hours on station. City's probably coming into sight now. Good, Jans grunted, looming over Ariel as she continued to hastily assemble her map. Looks like the scanners on this thing are actually worth a damn. Curiosity got the better of her natural aloofness. Elster found herself drifting over to inspect the image being splayed out, along with everyone else. Any expected artificial beauty to the city was thoroughly lost in the black and white bird's-eye view unfolding in front of them. Block after block of dark squares and rectangles, straddling broad white streaks that likely represented streets and open plazas. The scanner could hardly replicate exact detail, but it did a thorough job of giving them a usable street map, reliably finding areas that were impassable or blocked off. Invaluable for getting around, many of the streets looked to be blocked off by lines of debris or blockade, and enough of those black squares splotched outward like bleeding wounds on a canvas. Without even seeing it firsthand, it was plain the city was heavily damaged. Looks bad, Jan surmised quietly, frowning as she continued to lay down yet more pages. She was rapidly running out of room. It used to be very pleasant, Ariel mused, scratching his cheek. The invasion likely didn't help. Jan sighed and held the rest of the pages up to her chest, scowling. No, it didn't. She turned to Elster suddenly, squinting. Is there another table somewhere? No. Why would they have needed that? She took a step away toward the door, content to let them figure it out. She and Paul would need maps later, but she didn't want to be around them any longer. I'm headed back to the flight deck. We could try a crate down in cargo. Those are pretty flat, Zwei said, drawing an affirming hum from Mouse, while Ariel was already countering that there were whiteboards with the diagnostic materials. The conversation promptly muffled itself once the door shut again. No one had tried to stop her. Less than 2 hours into the mission, and she was already feeling exhausted by them. If she had been alone, she could just keep moving forward with singular purpose. Nothing to do but keep moving. It would have been easier if she'd gone alone. Easier for her peace of mind, anyway. But she was beginning to entertain the bitter notion that she'd simply been too easily browbeat by Paul, taken in a moment of emotional vulnerability. Every moment felt that way now, and every errant idea, fancy, and proposal held some manner of dark, seductive promise that it might lessen her misery. Her own thoughts simply spoke the loudest and most insistently, rudderless without Ariane's soothing presence. Could she be blamed for wanting comfort, though? Did she always have to carry this around in her chest? And she could feel it. A piece of lead the size of her fist sat right behind her breastplate. Sometimes, if she just leaned somewhere else a little, it felt a little less heavy. But she couldn't forget about it either. She needed this. Had to feel this misery with alarming and spiraling dread. Torrential. What else would keep her marching forward? She sighed deeply, taking a moment to rest her forehead against the flight deck door. Not much longer. Not much longer, and she'd be able to hopefully work some of the frustration out. She stabbed the open button and let herself in, just in time to take in the haunting, distantly approaching graveyard that was Svetloya. They were far away still, but the city was massive. Massive enough to be seen from their lofty perch in the sky, conspicuously clear of clouds or haze. A city of little towers, reaching for the heavens, sprawling across the double-pronged length of a peninsula that was itself juxtaposed against glittering water. Elster did not know much of Kitesh's geography, certainly not names, but she knew roughly what she was looking at. Before the Empire had climaformed the planet, Kitesh had been scarred by a colossal valley stretching across its surface, kilometers deep and thousands of kilometers long. The Grand Empress had turned it into a pristine, life-giving channel that encompassed its entirety, running up towards Kitesh's sole, northern ocean. Along its length was where most of Kitesh's population had settled, tilling the well-irrigated soil and feeding the rest of the empire with its bounty. Svetloya had been the nexus of that old effort, and from a distance one might have been forgiven for thinking it still looked the part. That illusion did not last as the Penrose continued towards it, closer and closer, until the stark, derelict reality was on full display. The Yuuzhan Empire's flair for architectural beauty hadn't been diminished by the nation's bureaucratic occupation. Not enough time to tear down all the sleekly white skyscrapers and lavish boulevards to replace them with brutalist monuments to efficiency. The invasion had done that job for them instead, and the system-wide apocalypse had seemingly done the rest. Many of the glittering towers had been torn apart by airstrikes, or scarred with holes and jagged wounds where artillery had struck, or brutal last stands had taken place. Much of that damage had been very obviously subject to hasty repair jobs that never saw conclusion, likely the invasion's work. More glaring were the plentiful examples of destruction that hadn't seen any infrastructural triage, suggestive of more recent fighting on a scale Elster hadn't been expecting. Buildings had simply toppled over and never been bulldozed aside. Jagged holes were left open to the elements. Major streets were left blocked with debris-strewn obstacles from nearby collapsed towers, pockmarked with craters and scorches from battle. Great sinewy lengths of cable, clustered and knotted together, hung low over the streets. The infrastructure disemboweled. The whole city was tinted red with the remnants of Kitesh's dust storms, left to settle and accumulate in great dunes that reached up and swallowed entire roads. Yet among all the devastation, modest swaths of the city still stood proudly amidst the ruins, as though nothing had happened at all. And, on the northern prong of the peninsula, 3 red stars gleamed feebly in the sun upon a massive, broad-sided skyscraper, riddled with holes, yet still standing at its full height. It was flanked by smaller clusters, which might have hoped to be its twin, but none of them could match it in size, let alone in faded grandeur. None of them, either, possessed the nation's signature insignia, nor the word Aeon in red letters at their peak. That was her target, the Empire's former Ministry of Imperial Welfare and Safety, turned into the nation's administrative center on Kitesh. The tower. They weren't close enough yet to make out any useful details about the surrounding terrain, but they'd get to that. Elster was already worried about the water. They couldn't feasibly land there, at least not to mobilize. "I've never seen a city before," Paul mused, her hands tightly gripped around the Penrose's flight stick. Elster was too taken in with the sight to bother being catty. "They don't all look like this. Better or worse?" Elster shifted uncomfortably. Without answering, she leaned over her cockpit seat and studied the decaying vista in front of them, rapidly coming closer and closer into view. No way of knowing what was inhabiting the ruins yet. "We close enough to start thermal imaging?" Unlike the long-distance terrain scanner, they'd need to actually be overhead for this one. Paul flipped a switch on the console, which duly lit up a green bulb above it. She gave a thumbs up back towards Elster, who in turn flipped a few more atop the printer, setting it back to work. With a punctuating stretch, Paul pushed herself up out of her seat, after engaging the autopilot. "I'm gonna go see how the rest are doing. Maybe work on a map for us." "Fine." Elster stepped aside to let her pass, then watched the door slide shut behind her before taking up the pilot's seat. Probably not the best idea to trust the automatic systems this close to a city. Through the viewport, the landscape lurched out of view to the right as she entered a circular holding pattern. She would have liked to examine it for herself a bit longer, but the sooner they had all the boring information-gathering parts done, the sooner they'd be able to see it up close and personal. Behind her, the printer was buzzing and belching out pages yet again, and likely would be for a few more minutes. At least she was alone again. Her thoughts naturally turned back to Ariane. She'd have liked to see that, Elster thought. The skyscrapers, gleaming like knives, and grey remains crumbling into still glittering waters. It was the sort of grand metropolis that she'd fantasized about sometimes. To walk down a street teeming with quaint little art shops and curio sellers, dressed in the finest of old imperial fashion. She would have made her put on some kind of rugged jacket, something masculine, and Elster would have made a face, but secretly be all too happy to indulge, because it suited her. Ariane would wear a dress, of course. Something white, showy but modern. Hand in hand, Ariane would stop to gawk at every little trinket that caught her eye. And Elster would watch her with all the fond patience one would expect out of a thoroughly smitten lover. They'd take an hour or more to get down a simple alleyway, caught up in the invisible, ineffable magic of it all. And all the while, innumerable people would pass them by, busy on their way to some romantic rendezvous or another. Their love, in these made-up fantasies, was not unique, not transgressive, not especially notable. It simply was. Cafe patio dreams, like in her movies. Those had been the daydreams of the early cycles, when their love had been fresh, electric, the sole object of their mutual fixation. Ariane would, red in the face with anxiety and nerves, slowly, tenderly reveal every secret, traitorous thought and obsession that had previously been poorly kept secrets. First the books, then the films, and finally, the cultural disloyalty. Why hadn't she been born in the empire of old, like Emile, or one of her other ridiculously barrel-chested serial heroes? Her fixations changed over the years, though. They seldom indulged in romantic fantasies out loud anymore, but now and then Ariane would wax philosophical, usually perched over her latest painting. A coastline full of crags and stillness. Brooding men staring off into nothingness, flanked by uncertain paramours. Ruined towers drowning in the surf. An island of tombs. She had a fondness for those scenes, and the thoughts and emotions they stirred within her, her calcified ennui come to life. Sometimes she painted what Elster presumed were ghosts. Old, dead friends, or friends who might as well have been dead. But there was joy there, and it made Elster happy to see. Elster was confident that, had Ariane a choice in the matter, she'd have preferred Svetloya as it was now. Dead, or perhaps still dying. A silent monument to a bygone age. She would have wanted to paint it very badly. Perhaps the both of them, hands still clutched together as they picked their way through wind-swept ruins, though, Elster had to admit, that was just a fantasy of hers instead. "Why do you never paint us in these?" she'd asked Ariane once, who gave the question all due consideration with a paint-streaked finger upon her chin. "I don't know," Ariane had admitted, and then made another stroke across the canvas. "I guess we're probably the ones watching." "The viewers." And she'd smiled, pointed at her with her paintbrush. "You and me." It was a pleasant enough answer, but Elster had never quite bought it. She just didn't bring it up again. Romantic vistas they were not. Personal to Ariane, though. Assuredly. It was her way of coping with her emotions. The darker ones. The ones Elster's love couldn't always quite soothe. It had, strangely, made Elster feel very uneasy for a few cycles after that. What was her method of coping with the things Ariane couldn't help her with? Did she even have one? Was it just slotting herself into the stasis pod and letting it scrub the worry away? She'd never really figured that one out, and the question became steadily more and more irrelevant as they began to wither and die under the cruel attention of the failing reactor. As her mind, nightmarishly, began to flee her anyways. Elster stared out the viewport, the white and blue sky occasionally disrupted by the errant peaks of nearby towers and distant landscape. Still no answer to that. None she wanted to dwell on. Then, the beeping started. Low and incessant, and baying for attention, and wrong. Something was wrong, and so too said the sharp red crosshair on the monitor in front of her, underlined with, "Incoming obstacle trajectory detected. Adjust course." That happened, once or twice during their initial flight? Great bodies of ice and a little twitch of the joystick on Ariane's part. But this time, the alarm turned to a scream. Ripped from her reverie, Elster did the first thing she could think of and threw herself onto the controls. Impact imminent. 5 o'clock. From below. Fast. She pitched down without thought, running on autopilot. Urgent. Possessed by something foreign and electric. Eamon Cho's jet pulled up into the heavens, spinning. Her flares failed to deploy. It's all up to smart maneuvering now. All she can do, on the ground, is bite her knuckles. But it worked. It worked because the Penrose gained speed, and the alert went back to incoming obstacle trajectory. Yeah, and she just had a few more seconds to try and think. Distantly, something slammed hard in the Penrose's interior. There was an ungodly rattling that made even Elster's stomach twist up in a knot. Nothing worked right, all of a sudden, with the sheer momentum pushing her back into her seat. Her arms didn't want to do what she was telling them to, which was to pull up. Damn it, pull up! Her whole body protesting the sudden, lurching G-force. A steaming, bright trail followed Eamon Cho from the skeleton of the city. They'd missed it. Missile entered her head, unbidden. Incoming obstacle was now incoming missile. And the now flashing impact imminent was missile imminent. They were being attacked. Someone was trying to shoot them down. Kill them. An early end to their useless mission. She sputtered, swearing under her breath, rolling the flight stick towards Svetloya's innumerable, shining towers, thinking that surely if she got an obstacle between her and this thing, it would fuck off, catch the light and explode on a wall somewhere. But the Penrose had the maneuverability of a tossed brick. And if this was anti-warship ordnance, what the hell was she meant to do? There was rattling, clanking. Somewhere, the Penrose was kicking its legs against itself in tantrum, screaming at its pilot. "What the fuck is happening?" Jans bellowed behind her, muffled through the door. She absently engaged the door lock. No distractions, no surrender. The radar monitor was flickering now, a radial view of the ship's immediate surroundings. Sure enough, an unassuming square was rapidly closing in on the center circle. Wouldn't be long, unless... The skyscrapers were here. She was flying over them. Any lower and she would have clipped the shortest of them. But some strange calm had fallen over her. A sense of singular precision. As much as she would come to loathe it later, the Penrose felt like it was part of her now. She flipped switches without thought and pushed the throttle forward, eyeing the gap between two towers. She knew the wingspan. She knew every single exact specification on this thing. Her whole stupid fucking life was dedicated to understanding it more intimately than any other replica or gestalt could. It would be a tight fit. She would make it. "You want to let it get close," Eamon Cho had bragged. "Then take a steep bank, 45 degrees, and you're free." Her eyes glitter. You're free. Sometimes, she just knew. Somehow, that calmness only grew. The flight stick felt lighter. Open the door. In a white-hot belch of smoke and flame and ignited fuel, the missile connected with the shining wing of Airman Cho's plane. There she was, exploding like a terrible firework in the Venetian dusk. It was all over in a few more seconds. From her cockpit seat, Elster could only watch as the two buildings roared past on either side, replete in shattered windows and rusted metal, shining brilliantly. The moment she was certain they were clear, she banked hard and turned. Outside the door, she was fairly certain Jan's and another had just been slammed into the floor. Sorry, but not really. The intruding square on the radar monitor abruptly winked out of existence, the crosshair gone. But the alarms did not cease. The G-load was heavy. Static played somewhere in the back of her mind. Somewhere there was a dull explosion, a shockwave, debris pinging off the hull, glass glittering into the expanse below, joining the water. This one frozen moment between consciousness and dream. Steel screamed. And then the rattling started. Furious and incessant. The alarms blared, and the monitors screamed. Course correct. Pilot intervention required. Skid detected. Course correct. What in the world was... No bother thinking about it. Just fly. She pulled hard on the flight stick, tried to get the nose of the Penrose in line with the trajectory of her turn, but the controls weren't responding to her, weren't playing nice. She was no longer an extension of the Penrose, no longer the wings, the connection severed, and neglected. She had not noticed the damage done in the turn. The Penrose was a scouting vessel. It had the maneuverability of a tossed brick. It was not made to take evasive maneuvers from military assault. The rattling was starting to shake the entire ship. And so, just like Elster lost her arm, the left wing of the Penrose snapped off as it entered a mad spin toward the ground.